Some life occurrences are so unexpected that they leave an impact that cannot be removed. That's how it was the day Zane strolled into my room unexpectedly. It was your normal afternoon. My husband, Adil, was at work as usual, and Zane, his son from a previous marriage, had lately returned following a traumatic split. Since Zane's return, we have been cautious around each other to avoid rekindling any old tensions. I was in my room trying on a dress for an upcoming function when I decided to change into something different. The door opened when I was changing, standing in my pants. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can keep giving you intriguing, genuine tales like these. Also, don't forget to watch this video till the finish and like it since the tale will be quite entertaining. Please click the like button to express your support. Maya, did you see Zane? Adil's voice is cut off. Zane halted in the doorway, his gaze widening. I gasped and hurriedly reached for anything to conceal myself. "Zane!" I yelled out, but he quickly turned aside, almost tripping. The door slammed shut, leaving me standing there, crimson from humiliation and uncertainty. Zane's homecoming had unnerved me. Adil had recommended it without first consulting with me, and while it did not surprise me given Adil's tendency to make decisions without considering the repercussions, it still seemed odd. "Zane requires somewhere to stay for a bit," Adil stated one evening, scarcely looking up from his phone. "You don't mind, right?" Naturally, I couldn't refuse. Zane had always been charming but aloof, and we had maintained a cordial, if superficial, connection, but having him here was different. His presence acted as a continual reminder of Adil's history, making the situation uneasy. Zane was undeniably beautiful at the age of 25. He had Adil's black hair and a strong jawline, but his eyes were softer and more attentive. He carried himself with serene assurance, which made his recent grief all the more unexpected. "He cheated on me," Zane revealed one night during supper when Adil was not around. I had attempted to keep the discussion light, but Zane's bluntness took me off guard. "I'm sorry, Zane," I said. "Don't be." He shrugged. "This occurs." One Wednesday afternoon, when Zane was supposed to be out running errands, I was in my room putting on dresses for an upcoming charity event. The dress didn't fit as well as I recalled, so I sighed and flung it on the bed. I was standing there in my bra and knickers, looking for something else, when the door opened. "Maya, did you see Zane?" His voice was stopped abruptly as his gaze took in the image. I froze. My hand remained on the hanger while his eyes wandered between me and the floor. His cheeks flushed deep crimson, and he swung around, nearly knocking over a light. "I apologize." He stuttered as he backed out of the room. Zane gasped and grabbed a robe. The door slammed shut, and I stood there, my pulse beating as I realized what had just happened. For the remainder of the day, I avoided him. I remained in my room, pretending to be busy, but I was unable to concentrate on anything. The memory of his surprised expression tormented me, and every time I thought about it, a blush of humiliation ran through me. We had a lot of stress during dinner that night. "Did you do those errands today?" I asked, trying to seem casual. "Yeah," Zane said, not looking up from his plate. Adil glanced between us, unaware of the discomfort. I told Zane he should take some time off and think things through. "That's a terrific idea," I responded, albeit my voice was too high. Zane looked up, his expression inscrutable. "I appreciate your hospitality," he remarked. "I will not remain longer than necessary." "Don't be ridiculous," Adil responded, dismissing the suggestion. "Your family." The days that followed were awful. Every conversation with Zane seemed tense, as if we were both trying not to breach an unseen boundary. He avoided being alone with me, and I told myself it was for the best. Despite my best efforts to forget about the incident, I found myself thinking about it more frequently than I wanted to. One evening, I saw him glancing at me from across the room. His stare was fleeting, yet it stayed long enough to make my stomach quiver. I quickly glanced aside, trying not to see, but the moment remained with me. It didn't take long before I noticed changes in his behavior. He started arriving home earlier and spending more time in common areas. One night, I discovered him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, holding a glass of water. "Can't sleep," I said, keeping my tone light. He shrugged, something like that. We stood in quiet for a minute, the only sound being the hum of the refrigerator. He quietly apologized the other day. "You do not need to apologize," I replied swiftly. "I shouldn't have just stepped in," he said, his eyes fixated on the floor. "It was an accident," I explained quietly. "Let's forget about that." He looked up, his gaze catching mine. "Is this what you want?" The question surprised me. I wasn't sure how to answer. "It's for the best," I eventually admitted. He nodded, but his look suggested he was not quite convinced. Things came to a climax one evening when a client contacted to inform him that he would be working late. When Zane entered, I was in the living room, skimming through a magazine. He paused at the doorway, undecided whether to remain or leave. "Want to watch something?" he eventually inquired, indicating to the television. "Sure," I said, tossing the magazine down. He sat down next to me. We observed in quiet. However, the air between us crackled with unsaid hostility. Our hands touched briefly as we grabbed for the remote, and I felt an electric charge. He drew his hand back immediately, his face going pink. "Sorry," he mumbled. "It's okay," I said, my voice trembling. The moment passed, but it left a lingering sensation of potential, which we both dismissed. A few nights later, I stayed awake well past midnight. The house was still, but for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock. I got out of bed and went to the kitchen to prepare tea, only to discover Zane was already there. He sat at the table, a mug of coffee in his hand, his eyes remote. The warm light from the under-cabinet lighting threw shadows on his face, making him appear older than his 25 years. "Can't sleep either?" I inquired, leaning against the door frame. He looked up, startled, and gave a tiny smile. Something like that. I got myself a cup of tea and sat down across from him. For a minute, we sat in silence. Then he surprisingly broke the silence. "Have you ever felt stuck?" he inquired, his voice quiet and calm. "Stuck," I murmured, turning my head. "You're just going through the motions," he remarked, peering into his coffee. "Doing what everyone expects but never truly living for oneself." His remark struck me harder than expected. I paused before answering. "Yes," I replied gently. He looked up more often than I'd care to admit, his gaze fixed on me. "What will you do about it?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I've spent a lot of time putting people first. This home is a great value. Never think about what I want." Zane's stare was steady. "Perhaps it is time you did." His comments remained in the air between us, posing a task that I wasn't sure I was up to. After that night, everything between us changed. It started little. A prolonged gaze, a handshake in the corridor. Zane visited me one afternoon as I was trimming roses in the garden. "Need assistance?" he asked, crouching next to me. "Do you know how to trim a rose bush?" I teased. He smiled and said that he had no idea. I chuckled and handed him the scissors. "Well, I hope you don't kill it." As we worked together, I felt at peace in a way I hadn't in years. Zane's presence grounded me in unexpected ways. I observed, "You're good at this," as I watched him gently clip a branch. "It's just the beginning." He smiled. No, truly, I replied. You have a keen eye for detail. He looked at me, his gaze softening. Maybe I learnt it from watching you. The compliment took me off guard and left me dumbfounded for a time. Later that evening, as we cleaned up from supper, our hands brushed again as we grabbed for the same dish. The brief encounter shot a shock through me, reminding me of all that had been building between us. Sorry, Zane mumbled, hurriedly yanking his hand back. It's fine, I answered, my voice trembling. He paused before speaking again. He murmured, Sana, staring up at me. Nothing. Never mind. The tension between us was tangible, and I knew things were going to shift. As time progressed, the differences between Zane and myself grew more apparent. We couldn't keep it hidden any longer. The mansion, once a sanctuary, now appeared as a boiling cauldron of secrets. Finally, the inevitable occurred. One morning, Adil confronted me in the kitchen. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he put out his phone to show confirmation of what had happened. I know what's been going on, Adil continued, his voice full of incredulity and rage. How long has it been going on? I couldn't force myself to meet his eyes. Months, I muttered. Tears streamed down my cheeks. Adil's face became glowing crimson with rage. Months? Well, I've been striving to create this for us. You have been... His voice cracked, and I could see the anguish in his eyes, but it was too late. Zane strolled in at that point, his countenance hardening as he took in the surroundings. Adil, this isn't all her fault, he said calmly but firmly. Don't protect her, Adil screamed, throwing his rage at Zane. You were meant to be my son. You have deceived me. I didn't intend for this to happen, Zane answered firmly, but I love her. Adil was incredible. Do you believe this is love? This is selfishness. The debate heated up fast, with accusations flying while I stood trapped in the midst, powerless. Adil finally yelled, Get out! Both of you leave my house. Please, Adil, I pleaded. But he moved away from me with a stern, determined face. I do not want to hear that. You've made your decision. Zane and I packed our belongings in quiet. The weight of our acts was heavy in the air. As I carried my bag into the car, I looked back at the home. It no longer seemed like home. It was simply where I used to reside. Are you certain about this? I questioned Zane as we got into the car. He did not answer quickly, keeping his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I do not know, I acknowledged gently, the uncertainty weighing heavily on my chest. As we drove away, my phone vibrated. Laura sent a message that included a link to a social media post. The post included screenshots of the messages between Zion and myself. The reaction was quick and harsh. Friends and relatives turned their backs on me. Their assessment was severe and cruel. An agreement was filed for divorce within days. They abandoned me, leaving me to rebuild my shattered life. Zane attempted to help me, but even he couldn't keep me safe from the storm. The burden of our choice became clear over time. The fissures in our relationship were difficult to overlook. One evening, as we sat in the modest flat we had leased, Zane gave me a serious look. This isn't what you wanted, he remarked quietly. I stared at him, tears welling in my eyes. It's not what you wanted either. Zane rose up and walked towards the door. He took a moment to look back at me. I will always care about you, he murmured gently, but we can't keep doing it. With that, he was gone. In the months afterward, I attempted to restore my life. Everyone around me whispered and judged me, reminding me of my faults. But in the calm times, I felt a feeling of clarity. For the first time in years, I started thinking about what I really wanted, not for Adele or Zane, but for me. Looking back, I recognized that I could not undo the past, but I could learn from it. And maybe, just maybe, I might find a way to go on. The weeks after Zane departed were the most difficult of my life. The flat was terribly silent without him, and the weight of all I'd lost weighed down on me relentlessly. Adele's absence. As predicted, it left a hollow pain. Friends I believed I could rely on had vanished, their judgment too heavy to disguise under polite discourse, but I couldn't afford to languish. The initial stages of reconstruction were unpleasant, yet essential. I accepted a job at a local art supply business, where I spent my days surrounded by vivid paints and blank canvases, both of which represented promise, but were rarely touched. Maya was the first to reach out. She contacted me one morning and suggested we meet for coffee. When she came, her tone was kinder than before, but her gaze remained cautious. "I'm not here to lecture you," she added quietly, "but I do want to know whether you're all right." I hesitated, wondering how to react. "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but I'm trying to be." Maya nodded, her face serious. "That is all you can do." Months later, just as the wounds were beginning to heal, a knock on my door interrupted the delicate quiet I had achieved. I opened it and froze. Adil stood in front of me. He appeared older than I recalled, his face worn, yet his presence was still as powerful. The tension between us was palpable as he stood there, scanning my face for signs of change. "Can we speak?" Adil inquired, his voice strangely calm. I stood aside to allow him to enter. Nevertheless, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken messages. He did not sit, but instead stood at the window, peering out at the street below. "I thought I'd hate you," he said quietly, "for what you did and ruined." I sat on the couch, my hands knotted uncomfortably in my lap. "A bargain. Let me finish," he said, turning to face me. "I expected to despise you, yet all I feel now is grief. For us, for what we may have been." His comment struck harder than anything else could have. I hadn't intended to harm him, but I did. I did not mean to hurt you. I spoke, my voice trembling. "I understand," he answered. His voice was still full of anguish, but that doesn't make things simpler. We talked for hours, recalling events from our marriage that we had overlooked at the time, but now felt momentous. By the time he departed, our wrath had subsided, and we had reached a calm agreement. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something I could rely on. Zane's leaving caused an emptiness that I couldn't describe. Where has he gone? Did he regret it? Did he still think of me in the same way I conceived of him? One evening, as I was leaving the art supply store, I discovered a note slipped behind my windscreen wiper. My heart jumped as I noticed the handwriting. "Sana," the letter started. I assumed leaving would make things easier, but it hasn't. "I still think of you, about us. I wonder whether you have moved on. I hope you did. Take care of yourself. Zane." The letter was not signed and did not need to be. I read it repeatedly, each word eliciting a range of emotions: relief, grief, and a little selfish hope that I hadn't been forgotten. Inspired by the letter, I resumed painting. At first, it was simply a method to fill the solitude, a distraction from the cacophony in my thoughts. But as the canvases filled with color, I felt a piece of myself return, one that I hadn't even recognized was gone until then. Maya came by one day and noticed the unexpected explosion of creativity. She looked at the paintings on the walls and exclaimed, "These are incredible. You should show them." "I'm not sure." I hesitated. "Don't doubt yourself, Sana," Maya insisted. "You've got something worth sharing." A year after Zane had departed, serendipity brought him back into my life. I was at my own exhibition opening when I noticed him across the room. He looked older, yet the draw was still there. "Sana," he whispered quietly as he neared Zane. I responded, my heart pumping. We remained there for a bit, the commotion in the room receding into the background. "You did it," he said, nodding to the paintings around us. "I had to," I answered, my voice firm for myself. He nodded, a grin forming on the edges of his lips. "I'm proud of you." We spoke for hours that night, catching up on everything and nothing. By the time the gallery was empty, the space between us was filled with silent understanding. Zane did not stay in town, and his departure was not as painful as it had been previously. It seemed like the end of a chapter, one that I will always cherish, despite the anguish it caused. As I stood in my studio, surrounded by the hues and textures of my new life, I knew that, while the past will always be a part of me, it would not define me. For the first time in years, I felt peaceful.